Hey, it's Andryanna. Welcome back to the Juggle Is Real. Last week's episode was such a special one. If you haven't listened, you definitely should listen. We had a panel of incredible women for International Women's Day, and this theme that we explored was building what didn't exist. And so I had the privilege of speaking with women who looked at systems that weren't working in trades, in healthcare, marketing, real estate, community leadership. And these incredible women did not wait for someone else to fix that gap. They decided to build something new. And what struck me most during the conversation, the success stories were great, but it wasn't that. It was how each and every one of these women started from the same place, not with a perfect plan, not with a ton of money or funding, not with guarantees. They started with this lived experience, right? They were experiencing something in their lives that just wasn't working, something that was frustrating or was limiting them or just felt outdated. And then step by step, piece by piece, they began to build something better. And listening back to that conversation after, I realized that I had asked these women the questions about their journeys, but I didn't answer any of the questions myself. And I know if you've been listening for a while that you might know a little bit about my own life over the last several years. But I did realize that I have been building something that didn't exist too, not necessarily a specific product or, founding a business or a startup, but I've built a life and a career that didn't exist for me before. And so today, I thought that I could share a little bit about that story. Because if you're listening right now and you're feeling like something in your life needs to shift, I want you to know that most of the time, these transformations do not start with a giant leap. They start with the really small steps and the tiny little pivots. So today, I want to share what burnout actually looked like for me and how I went from a traditional 40-hour-a-week office job to working for myself. I want to talk a little bit about that middle, that invisible part that no one really shares too much about, and then what building something new really looks like in real life. Because if you're listening right now and thinking like, I loved last week's episode, I feel like something needs to change for me, but I don't even know where to start. You're exactly who this episode is for. So let's dive right in.
This is the Juggle Is Real podcast. I hope you feel seen, that you realize your worth, lighten your load, and prioritize your own needs. As we hear from leading experts and well-known faces in the wellness, entrepreneurship, education, and motherhood space, I hope you gain insights, proven practices, and learn actionable tools to help you enjoy the juggle of work, family, and everything in between with a little less stress and a lot more ease, joy, and fun. Most of all, I hope you find what you need to simplify, streamline, and supercharge your own journey of better balance and self-love. Are you with me? Let's get started.
This episode of The Juggle Is Real is supported by Dove. We are in that in-between season. We're not quite out of winter, but we're not fully in spring. There's still snow where I am, and we're actually supposed to get a lot more snow in the next few days. But then the sun is coming out and it's trying to make an appearance. And I don't know about you, but my skin always feels it around this time of year. The dry air, the heating, the shifts in temperatures, it can leave skin feeling tight and maybe a little uncomfortable. So I have been leaning into small upgrades that make everyday routines feel more intentional. And that's where Dove comes in. Dove's Deep Moisture Body Wash delivers 24-hour lotion soft skin that feels nourished and cared for even when the weather can't decide what it's doing. And the new scents, Tropical Coconut and Warm Vanilla, completely shift the mood of your shower. They both smell great, and they are helping the vibes go from winter drab to fresh, warm, and comforting. It's like a small reset and a short pause amidst even the busiest of days. The formula is gentle, it is paraben-free and sulfate-free, and it supports your skin's moisture barrier for everyday use. You can look for Dove Deep Moisture Body Wash at retailers near you and explore the new tropical coconut and warm vanilla scents to refresh your routine as we ease into spring. Now let's get back to the episode. So I'd like to start sort of at that time when the system stops working for you. So I want you to think about yourself and your life and how you're feeling right now. And then maybe apply it to how I'm going to share the journey and how things have progressed for me. Because there was a time in my life when everything looked completely fine on paper. I had a stable job. I worked, the 9 to 5, 40, 50 hours a week. I had a lovely little office. I had 2 young kids. Life was busy, but there was a lot of structure. But then internally, I was just so drained, so exhausted, and so overwhelmed in a way that just getting more sleep was not going to fix. And what I understand now, but didn't fully understand then, is that burnout most of the time isn't just about you working too hard. And in fact, there's research from McKinsey's Women in the Workplace report that shows that women experience higher burnout rates when they are navigating both professional demands and the invisible management of family life. And for me, it wasn't that I wasn't capable, but it was that the structure of my life, there wasn't a lot of alignment there anymore. And it did take me years to realize this, but even though I felt like a total failure at the time, this feeling was not a personal failure. It was a strain on my capacity. I was just operating inside a structure that wasn't designed for the life that I actually had as a mother and someone with a lot of ambition and drive. And I remember thinking something really clearly at the time, which was kind of just like, if I keep going on like this, if I just keep doing this every single day, then nothing changes. And my energy is not going to improve. My schedule is not going to clear up. And I won't have that presence that I desperately wanted with my kids. So I knew that something had to shift. And so that kind of brings me to sort of that first little pivot. And it really was just about creating space, which, I mean, I'm not telling you to go back all the way to episode 1 of the Juggle Is Real, because that episode is terrible, but that's the title of the episode, is creating space. So the first thing that I did, it was not to quit my job. Okay. I think that this is important to say, because when people tell their story backwards, it can sound like, okay, and then I just made this one big change, this big brave leap. And then all of a sudden, like, bam, snap my fingers and everything shifted. Like, most of the time, it's like the series of the smaller little steps. And so the first little step that I made, it wasn't dramatic. I did not quit everything overnight. What I did was I moved into post-secondary education, and I became a professor at a local college. And at first, it wasn't even quitting my job, my full-time job. It was just taking on one night class while I was still working my full-time job. And yet that semester was especially overwhelming because I still had my young children and there was just a lot on my plate. But then I took this leap into post-secondary education, and I worked in post-secondary education for 6 years. And this shift mattered because, like, I was still working for someone else, right? But the structure of how I was working changed. So there were times, of course, I still had to be there to teach my classes and lead my courses. I did have somewhat of a schedule, but it was more flexible. And I had a little more autonomy, and I could be a bit more present with my family. And then at the same time, something else was happening that was probably just as important, if not more important. I was beginning to heal myself out of the burnout, out of the hustle mode. And this was the season where I started really leaning into personal development and doing a lot of reflection, like that self-reflection and learning, reading the self-help books, and just rebuilding my relationship with ambition and what I thought my life should look like. And not the ambition that completely depletes you and left me totally drained and feeling exhausted, but learning what ambition could possibly look like when it aligns with who you are and what your values are. and something that could create some breathing room. And in creating a little bit more space, that is truly what changed everything. So it was a small little step. But then there was another moment that I realized my life could continue to expand and grow. And this is, I think, just where alignment can show up, because then we move into the pandemic and I was working virtually and something unexpected happened. Life, of course, you recall during the pandemic years slowed down in ways that none of us expected. But then in other ways, it was so much more full. I had two young boys at home. The online schooling, that was a whole other thing, trying to teach children. One of my kids, undiagnosed, was neurodivergent, also has a learning disability. There was a lot more on my plate, but then also there was a lot more time. And then that's when we found out that I was pregnant. And it wasn't totally planned, but it was something that we had always considered, just weren't sure if we were ready for it. And then something in that moment really did feel different, because when we found that out, instead of feeling overwhelmed or just straight up like being in panic or shock, I remembered thinking like, I think we could do this. Like, I actually think I have the capacity for this. And that was new. And it was the first time in a long time that my life had felt really aligned, enough that expansion in the form of, inviting a new member into our family felt like it would be okay. And psychologists often talk about something that's called learned possibility, which is basically capacity as an internal state, not just like having time or your schedule, things within your schedule. And when our lives became more aligned with our values, like my nervous system could actually experience more perceived capacity. And so while, yes, we couldn't really go anywhere, our schedules weren't busy with like the usual stuff during the pandemic, there was, seemingly way more on my plate. And yet I felt like I could do more and be more and introduce a new member into our family. Because when you start rebuilding your life in ways that feel aligned, you start believing that expansion is possible again. And when one area of your life opens up, you get a little bit more of that space and that breathing room, your brain becomes more willing to imagine growth in other areas. And I mean, I'm not saying that this has to mean for you that, you're going to, expand your family. Like for me, for us, that meant welcoming another child into our family. But it also meant that we learned very quickly that life wasn't going to get more simple. It wasn't going to slow down, but it could become more aligned. And a question that we explored on the IWD panel last week in the last episode, it was about capacity. Because I mean, if you're listening, chances are you're carrying work and your family, your own care, businesses, children, creative projects, responsibility within your community. And the truth is that capacity isn't just about time. It's really about alignment. And when the work you do reflects your values, when your schedule reflects your priorities, your energy shifts. And that doesn't mean things all of a sudden become easy, but it does mean that it becomes more sustainable and it feels so much more doable. And so this is kind of where the Juggle Is Real was born, and me starting my podcast without even knowing what it would become, because Zach was born in March 2021. And in September of 2021, I started my podcast. And, like if I'm being honest, it did not start with a grand strategy. I'd had no, proposals. There was not a lot there. It just started because I had this feeling, this inkling. And I had these stories and conversations that I wanted to bring into the world, having real conversations and sharing about burnout and motherhood and the mental load and having ambition and wanting to feel connection and have deep relationships and just the complications and the reality of real modern life. And so I started recording. And I have talked about this before. I've sort of talked about the roots of this podcast. The audience was super small at first. I think I had like 7 downloads of my first episode, after the first couple of weeks. It was so small. But I kept going and I was consistent and I kept showing up. And this is, I think, the part that no one really talks about, and the part that we don't necessarily hear people talking about out loud often. And that is building new things. It's not glamorous most of the time. It doesn't look polished and it's not super pretty, and there's no perfection anywhere near. And this is sort of the invisible work, because building something new does involve a lot of invisible work, and this is a question that we talked about last week. And some of the panelists spoke to the invisible work in their careers and how they're managing that. Some of them spoke to the invisible work at home and with their families and how they're managing, the weight of the world. But for me, it looked like recording episodes when, like, basically there's no one listening yet, posting things when the engagement is really small, writing emails and pitching myself out there and learning new technology and just trying ideas. And sometimes things didn't work, and then, adjusting and trying again. And there's research in entrepreneurship that calls this consistent micro action. It's not one big moment. It's just like many, 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 like hundreds of small actions over time. And I think that this was one of the most important things, like during the season. And I laugh and I say, well, don't listen to episode 1 called Creating Space, because it's terrible. But now, we're almost 200 episodes in, and I feel so much more comfortable. And I'm not literally just writing a story and reading it off of like a Microsoft Word document, So even during that time, the important thing was that I stayed true to that initial mission and that inkling that I had. Even when hardly anyone was listening or nobody was watching, I just kept asking, like, how can I support women? How can I support even the 8 people who are listening? How can I share something useful? And then that invisible work, it does compound. And those hundreds of little micro action do start to snowball. And this is called iterative building. And I don't know why I can't say iterative, but it's tricky for me. It's not about having the perfect idea. It's the multiple iterations, right? Learning through action. And we did talk about this in, I think, an episode in January, right? It's like you don't get the motivation and then you take the step. Like, you have to take a small step and then you figure out, oh, I actually can do this. And then you get the motivation to continue moving forward. So then slowly, like piece by piece and step by step, things start to grow. And for me, they started to grow. And then it started to become real, because slowly things did start shifting and opportunities opened up and partnerships started forming. And then eventually I felt like I could leave that role in post-secondary education. And I crossed this threshold into something that I honestly never even thought could be possible. And I was earning 6 figures working for myself. And I do want to say, like, the most important part of the shift, it wasn't the money. And of course, I don't want to downplay that at all, because women earning more is supporting everyone. But more important than the money was the autonomy. And there is research in occupational psychology that consistently shows that autonomy is one of the strongest predictors of long-term career satisfaction. And I'm not just saying you have to be self-employed for this, but the ability to direct your own work is one of the strongest predictors of long-term job satisfaction. And so here I was for the first time feeling like my work fit my life. And so this platform that started with this like terrible, like little earbuds and this idea really turned into something so much bigger. And so now we get into building the life that we wanted, because this change, there's that ripple effect, right? And it rippled into our lives. And I have talked about this, you're probably getting sick of this, but we've moved into our home that was once just a dream. But more importantly here, this success story is that I was able to build a life where my work supports my family instead of competes with it. And I'm not saying that the schedule is always open and I can always do all the things and I'm 1000% always here with my family. There are busy times too. There are times when there's pinch and there's tightness, but overall, the real success and the real win for me is having my work support my family instead of the other way around. And I feel truly honored and privileged to say this, but it wasn't something that happened overnight. And so when we get into this year's International Women's Day theme of the gift to gain, and the question that I asked the women on last week's panel was that, when we invest in women, opportunities expand and systems strengthen. And I asked the women, like, what has giving made possible in your own journey? Women have gone through mentorship and collaboration and have created opportunities. And so I personally have been thinking about this question a lot because when I look back on my own path, I can see how much of where I am now was shaped by giving first, right? Like hitting record, sharing ideas, inviting people to speak with me to amplify their voices, amplifying people through the conversations we're having and offering support. And even when it didn't immediately benefit me, the surprising thing was that giving did help me create that momentum and did help me form new relationships and new collaborations, and then opportunities opened up. And this is what we call reciprocal networks when generosity becomes the operating system. Growth becomes collective. And I think this is where women especially stand out because we are built to give. And now we have to understand that the gain and the receiving part is all part of the system. And we need to receive as much as we give. And that was a lesson I had to learn, like big time, big time. So, what building didn't exist really means for me. And in reflecting on last week's episode, I realized that, it doesn't always mean launching a company or having to come up with a new invention, but that can be it too. But sometimes it means building a schedule that really just works for your family. It means building your career so that it can fit your capacity throughout the different stages of your life. And it means having a creative outlet that gives you purpose, whether it's in your career or in volunteer work that you're doing, or how you're serving your family members, and just a life where your values actually show up in your daily decisions. And as you're saying yes, or as you're saying no to things, like what your values are so clear and in the back of your mind at all times. And so oftentimes it just starts with just like these little tiny things, like having one conversation or going out for that one coffee, having that idea that just doesn't seem to leave you alone, and just like making one tiny little shift, like one small change. So if you're listening right now and you are thinking like, I feel stuck, or I do want to change, or I do want something to shift, I want you to know that most women who eventually build something meaningful, like the women who are on the International Women's Day panel, like they start in exactly the same place. And it's not with perfect clarity, but most of the time it's with a little bit of friction. A little discomfort is often the first signal that something new wants to emerge. And that's not a bad thing. So today, I want to leave you with 3 questions that you can ask yourself. Where in your life does something feel out of alignment? Where do you see a gap, something that isn't working? And what might be the smallest step towards building something new? Like, what could that look like for you in a tiny and very simple way? And I'm not saying 5 years from now. I'm not saying when life is perfect and the chaos subsides. I am talking about this month. We're in March. Right now, we're celebrating women. We want to celebrate you because building what didn't exist rarely begins with the grand plan and gesture. It pretty much always begins with that little decision that something needs to change. And so if you listened to last week's episode and felt inspired by those women, those incredible women, I hope that today's conversation reminds you that we all start in the same place. is not with certainty. Okay. So you don't need the perfect plan. You just need one next step. And I want to thank you so much for being here today as we close things out. If this episode resonated with you, I would love it if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it as well. And if you haven't already, can you please leave a rating, a short review on Apple Podcasts? It helps this podcast reach more women who are navigating their own version of the juggle. And that really does support everyone. So I'm so grateful that you're here. Thank you so much. And I will see you next week on the Juggle Is Real podcast. Until then, take good care.